Welcome to Zeitgeist Radio, the podcast for music lovers to expand their horizons into new and interesting musical subcultures. I'm your host, Morgan Rowe, founder of the Zeitgeist Academy. Each episode, I interview someone from a different musical community. Zeitgeist means spirit of the times, and my goal is to make that spirit come alive for you and help you appreciate musical communities you may not know much about. Before we get into the episode, head over to zeitgeistacademy.com/radio. You can see episodes and transcripts and also sign up for my newsletter. There's always more to a topic than can be covered in one conversation, so each week I send a deeper dive into something related to the topic. You'll also be able to access the archives to see past content. That's ZEITGEIST academy.com/radio. My guest today is Sophie Lippert, a cellist and pianist in Western Massachusetts. Sophie, welcome to Zeitgeist Radio.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
Yeah, can't wait to talk with you. Let's start with you. How would you describe yourself musically to our listeners?
Sure. So I am certainly a musician at core. I'm a trained classical pianist and have been pulling out my cello a lot recently. I have cello in my lineage as well. But my classical background now very much informs an expansion of what being a musician feels like right now to me. So I have a penchant in particular for elevating, playing, exposing works by underrepresented composers, in particular music by women. And that has been incredibly rewarding for me to bring my training, my very traditional classical background and training and technical abilities and apply it to really just give voice to all of this music that isn't being played. It is astonishing to me how much great music is written that is not in the common vernacular. So that's one branch of who I am and what I do in the world. I am also an entrepreneur, so I'm always kind of thinking about how to create a career for myself and by extension, like a world, right? How can what I'm doing in the world be of greater benefit to the community of people around me, to myself? How can it be more kind of rewarding and sustainable and fulfilling and engaging? And how can it be impactful? And I really do think a lot about that, and that's one of the reasons I think it does feel so aligned to me to be doing this work, to expose works that don't get played very often, because I do think about, it in the most modest way. I want to always orient it a little bit towards like, what is the fingerprint that I have, like who am I as a person? What do I have to do here that could make a little bit of a difference? And that feels really, really important and meaningful to me to think about. I'm also a teacher, so I have a great studio of students of all ages, in particular teens and adults, and I love that work, mostly teaching piano. And last but not least, I am an event curator and a space holder. I really think of myself a lot as someone who kind of holds space for or creates a container for some magic to happen. So yes, it takes my expertise and capabilities in a certain way, but then I have to kind of stand back and let the art flow through me. Frankly, I feel that way sometimes, even as a player, right? Like what I'm doing is using the combination of skills and capabilities that I've picked up over the years to play this great music, but it feels way less about me than it does kind of about, being a container for it, or being a catalyst, a conduit for it. And I feel that way too about the work I do, creating events and concerts and spaces for community to be there, right? I'm holding the space in order for something kind of special to happen within it, but it's way more about that specialness than it is about me.
Yes. Oh, so many thoughts. First off, I've been really loving the word curator lately because I had a guest on a little while ago who is she curates events in LA, and it's the way she spoke the word curator just brought it like such to life for me. Um, that's the episode with Mel. I can put the link in the show comments. Amazing human being who's kind of doing that same thing. I've just been thinking a lot on that word curation and um, how there's so much in the world that to go into a space that's been carefully curated. I know when I go into those spaces, like it's so amazing and magical that it's very carefully put together. So that's kind of what I'm sensing in what you're doing for the concerts and the community
Yeah.
curation. Also, we met in Portland, and I know a lot of musicians, obviously, but one thing that has struck me about you is the way that you embody heart in like it
Mhm.
really shines from deep in you out. And I'm kind of getting that sense as well as you're describing what you're doing. It's like you have this heart, the spirit and heart are in alignment, and then all of that gets pushed out. So those are just two observations on your beautiful introduction.
That was gorgeous. Thank you for that reflection.
Yeah. Um, so you have started or restarted something that caught my interest to where I reached out called these connections concerts. Can you describe what those are and maybe the history of where they came from?
Sure. Yes. Well, I like a good title. I like a good alliterative title. So this one does that, right? The
Yeah.
Connections concert series. But the word connection is so foundational. When I was thinking about initially dreaming in 2017, 2018 about what this concert series might want to be, this whole list of names. By the way, Zeitgeist Radio, fabulous name.
Thank you.
This whole list of names, and then I'm, thinking creatively, all these kind of delicious, interesting sounding things. But at its core, I just kept coming back. Like, Connections Concerts is about connection first and foremost, and it just feels so important to have that word in its title, even. So it's about connecting classical music with other genres of music at its core. It's about connecting audiences more deeply with the listening and concert experience than often will happen at a traditional show. It's about connecting unique and diverse and eclectic musicians who would not generally be on a stage together. And it's about connecting audience members even with each other, kind of within that container, right? So we always have classical music on the program and some kind of melange of like traditional classical stuff and then modern classical works by composers that don't generally get played. And then always there are one or two or three, or sometimes in my more ambitious endeavors, even more performers from different genres that also come onto the stage and share that space. And we generally do a little bit of trading off. So really letting people kind of share from their zone of genius and demonstrate who they are in their general form, right? The hat that they generally wear as a musician or performer. And then we do some collaborations between all of the musicians together. And there's always moments for the audience to both engage with each other, kind of we'll generally give some sort of conversation prompt and then ask people to turn to someone next to them and speak a little bit. And or someone on the stage will lead some sort of intentional experience. So we did earlier this year on one of the shows, I kind of did this meditative soundscape, which landed underneath an experience where the audience came back. We were pulling people back from intermission. We said, okay, come as you're coming back, let's all kind of land in this space together. And we guided people through breathing and kind of like a little thought process, and then we all sang together. We all vocalized together in that space. And so, again, lots of different threads, and there are different iterations and ways it expresses, but foundationally, it is about connecting all of the people in the room to each other, to the music, and to an experience that's hopefully, hypothetically, and often does really feel genuinely that it something emerges that's so transcends any one of those one kind of forces.
Zeitgeist moments.
Yeah,
We'll get to that again later, but yeah.
there it is.
Now these you are in Massachusetts now, but these started in Portland, am I right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I went to one at the old church in Portland. Um, is the iteration that you're doing now the same? Has it evolved? Obviously, we had a huge pandemic in between. Um, what's your what are your thoughts? How has this event evolved over the last several years?
Yes. Well, there are certainly some significant differences and some significant ways that it really does embody the same mission and ethos. So I had this vision was birthed in 2018, 2017, 2018. I was awarded a very significant grant from a Portland grant writing organization, and was able to therefore fund a series which was going to be 8 shows. It did end up being abridged by the pandemic, but it was the scope was, not huge, but it was significant. It was one of the biggest, most impactful things. And having a full season of 8 concerts that people could subscribe to right off the bat, if they wanted to, or buy one off, so it was and I had the full roster lined up even before any of the shows started. So that was, I was really thinking more, kind of like if I was a producer of a chamber series or a symphony program, like what the scope, I really needed to be incredibly organized and have it all planned out beforehand. And I'm really proud of my ability to do that. It was ambitious and very exciting. And then, yes, pandemic happened and life changed, and life took me to Tel Aviv, Israel for 14 months, and I got married and I had a baby, and now we're here in Massachusetts, and I actually have, in the recreation, rebirthing of Connections concerts, one of the key things that happened was that I found another human being who was doing something already very much like Connections concerts. In fact, she called them conscious Connections concerts, but almost identical, even in the branding. And she and I, Charlotte Malin, soon to be Charlotte Collins, she's getting married in just less than a month, found each other and immediately were clear that we needed to create something together. And so Connections concerts in its current iteration is kind of a confluence of what Charlotte was bringing into the world and what I was bringing into the world. And so, I mean, there's some key differences simply because we're running it as a team of 2 rather than a team of 1. That is, and that we could do a whole episode on that, right?
Right.
The difference between kind of sole entrepreneurship and working as a team in collaboration. And there are incredible blessings and incredible challenges, and it all is part of the milieu. But it has been the shows. We continue to open the shows much like I did in Portland, Oregon, which is always welcoming people and inviting them in as co-creators to the experience and saying a few intentional words, and then um, really showcasing and elevating lots of types of music alongside each other. All of those components that I spoke about earlier, they do still exist. So I would say I'm still learning what Connections Concerts is here in Massachusetts in 2024. We've had only 2 shows, and we have one more this calendar year, and then we'll see what comes next, right? So I could tell you all of the subtle differences, but I'm almost like, let me let's just keep listening. I just want to keep listening to the concert series kind of as a business and as its own entity, and see what else we're gonna know a lot more after even one more concert. And then, after Charlotte and I sit together and say, okay, what wants to come next, and depending on the performers that come into our space and into our sphere and that we're collaborating with, that changes things a lot. I mean, at our next show, we have a poet for the first time. We have never kind of reached beyond. I've had a spoken word artist, but never reached beyond a more exclusively musical realm. Although we did feature a dancer at one of the shows in Portland, and that was really fun. So anyway, I think it will continue to shapeshift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a phrase that we say at my day job, which has nothing to do with music, but it's a phrase that I love, which is your community decides who you become. You may have
Yes.
all this business plan and all this like stuff figured out in your head, but then ultimately the people that walk in your doors and the people that uh, come to your business or come to your concerts, they help shape who you
I
are and
love
who you
that.
become in the
That
future.
that's so spot on.
Oh, I love it. So, let's talk about some of the people involved. So you mentioned that you have a collaborator now.
Yes.
Um, as far as the guest artists, like who are these people? How do you find them? Who do you decide to curate in? And is it do you ever like put people like, hey, I see you, but not for this one? Like how does
That's a
that work? How do you decide who is part of each concert?
that's a great question. So, network community is everything in a situation like this, partially because I have been really committed. When I did the series in Portland, I wanted to definitely feature Pacific Northwest artists and stay local. And we've been feeling the same way in this current iteration in Western Mass too, really trying to pull people from New England regionally. And partially because it makes it much easier logistically. We can generally have more rehearsals than just one the day before or at the dress rehearsal or whatever. But it also means that we're really, again, being responsive to and within the community, the local community that we're within. Um, because these still are mostly in-person events. We did live stream the last one, and that felt very rewarding and exciting to me because I love to reach out beyond in-person audiences. And there is something very special about being in a room at the same time. And
Mhm.
the ecosystem that we create there is just like, oh, it's so special to be within those spaces. And I think that I and many other people are remembering that even more after the pandemic gave us some space away from those in-person spaces. So I really look around me at the community and at the network of musicians that's around. I am very curious. I am an eclectic listener. I listen very widely to music. I am kind of a nerd with concert calendars. So I will, who's playing what, if I see a name popping up a lot or someone keeps mentioning, I'm kind of taking mental notes all the time. And I'm desirous when I'm looking for collaborators of, really people who are very, you know, just embody their craft with a lot of, with a lot of skill and a lot of heart. I liked that you named that early on, kind of this confluence of heart and spirit, and how it just feels like that's part of the energy that I want to create on stage and in the space of a Connections concert. And it's so valuable if there are performers. It doesn't matter what type of music you make or what type of art you make. I'm more interested in if we can like speak the same language in terms of the type of environment that we're trying to cultivate together. So it's almost more important to me. I wouldn't say it's personality, right? But it's kind of musical ethos.
Yeah.
And I find that in a killer singer-songwriter, and I can find that in an amazing jazz musician. Or we had this kora player, John Hughes, who hails from Brattleboro, Vermont. And he played with Charlotte and I in our show earlier in April this year. And it was just so clear. I saw him play, I saw him play a few months before at a venue in town in Amherst, and just seeing him play, not only was I incredibly moved by the music itself, but I could feel that the heart within it and the openness to using music as a tool for connection. And so I would say, yeah, it's going to concerts and listening and listening to the music and listening to the community around me. And in terms of choosing who goes where, that can be a very interesting. It is very much that's one of the things that people can't see when they're at a show, just how much thought and energy has gone into all of this, all of the minutia, all of the decisions that are made. But yes, certainly thinking of who belongs on stage with who and what sort of environment, what sort of pairings we can make that will really enhance the experience for attendees. And that really varies on a case-by-case basis. And sometimes I guess well, and sometimes it doesn't work quite as well, but almost always, even if it feels like it's a little bit, I've always been surprised by, no matter how different the performers are who end up on a stage together, how many threads we can find to weave together.
Yeah. I love this. A lot of my project here is recognizing that the way I phrased it with several folks is I'm classically trained as well, as you know.
Yes.
And I feel like we have our own like classical silo that we've like worked our way up however far down, we have like our silo, and we look across and we see people in the jazz silo or the bluegrass silo or like whatever silo, and we have this like, oh, I see you there. I may not know how you got there. I may not be able to play jazz or bluegrass, but there's like this I get you, because you know how much like the work and everything that goes into reaching a certain level in any genre. And it's kind of this building those connections is what I'm reminded of here with you, is like, as long as you see someone actively looking out and not just in their own little silo of their own genre, like if you're willing to look around and see who else is looking around, it's like a pretty incredible community of openness with other musicians.
Yes.
Oh. Let's talk about the people who come. So staying on the topic of people, these are community events, but do you notice any patterns of people who are interested, who either come in person or who join the live stream? Did you have success with your live stream, and what types of people were tuning in on that as well?
Yes. We did have success. We had about 60 people show up on live stream, which was pretty
cool.
Yeah. This is one of the reasons I love this concert series, because yes, there are trends, but the audiences are also very diverse.
Cool.
And there's something that reminds me of, I have this fantasy about a fantasy that I've actualized about having dinner parties. One of my favorite things in the world is having dinner parties with people who wouldn't generally be at that table together. And I hosted when I ran a yoga studio and wellness space for 6 years in Portland earlier in the 2012 to 2018. And one of the things we did there was this dinner series. And that was exactly what that felt like, is that people would look around and be in the same space at the same time, that who were not accustomed to being at tables with the people like who they were looking across at. And so there certainly is more that I could do to reach even more broadly out. But when I have performers who are very different on stage, I will always get people who are fans of those different performers in the room at the same time. So just because it's circumstances permit it and invite it, we have people who love classical music, and we have people who love, say, let's speak about this concert with John Hughes, for example. We have people who love to listen to the kora. And so first of all, there's an overlap in those, I would be one of those people who loves to listen to classical music and the kora, but oftentimes they are different communities, right? And so even just, from the pure fact that we have performers who are playing different types of music, people will come into that room because they like to listen to one or the other type of music. And then we will, invite them. They will, whether or not they signed up for it, right? But we really, they get much more than their money's worth in terms of like, okay, now that you're here, you're going to hear that, and you're going to hear a lot more. But I will say, so we often do get adventurous listeners, right? Or people who might be interested in classical music being done differently. I would say I'm in a pretty fruitful space for that, because there's a big university community in Western Massachusetts. We have this big consortium of colleges. So there are lots of people making music, lots of professors and students and people involved in music communities around here who are oftentimes interested in not just doing classical music in the way that it's always done. And so there's, yes, the fact that there's some fertility for that here already, or, it's, people are open, I would say, here. And so that's nice to have audience members. And I certainly we have people from the classical community who come. But we got interviewed on the big NPR station for the last show at the NEPM, New England Public Media. And so we had also, a few people who drove down from New Hampshire who were like a jazz trumpet player who was like, I'm interested in collaborating with other types of musicians. This sounds really cool. I want to come to this show, and someone who was sitting behind another friend in the audience who's been involved for years in the traditional folk music scene. And he heard our interview, and Charlotte, in addition to being a fabulous classically trained violinist and violist, also writes original music. And so in our interview on the radio, she sang one of her original songs along with a plucked viola part. So it's soulful and simple and very much oriented in folk music tradition. And so we had a couple of people who love folk music who came. So I will say it's, in general, if someone shows up, they have to be at least open enough to consider that they're going to hear something that they don't generally hear, or be a part of an experience that they don't generally that they're not generally a part of. But, there's lots of different types of people who are curious and who are a little adventurous or maybe a little reckless, like, sure. Okay, let's try this out, So it
sounds
does.
like to me like your audience would be almost just as interesting as your performers to just like
Yeah.
talk to these people. Like, who are you? Why are you here? They sound interesting.
And Morgan, that's something that I would like to do because I would say it's not as well defined here. I did enough shows in Portland and I was entrenched enough in that community before I started the concert series.
Yeah.
But I could tell you more clearly who my audience was there. Here, I'm still learning again. So I have not done what I would love to do. And we did in Portland. And I thought it was brilliant. And there's a couple of things that we've done that I'm like, why don't people do this more often? But I did an audience survey in the middle of the concert one time because I'm like, what I'm in, maybe it was concert 3 of 8 concerts. Like what would be more valuable for me in figuring out the trajectory of this series than to learn from the people who came?
Yeah.
So if I've got 100 people in the room right then, I can ask people to fill out surveys afterwards, but they're not,
gonna do that.
2 people are going to. And so give them an opportunity to do it right then in that space was, selfishly very helpful, but I hope, was also valuable for the attendees who would come for the rest of the series. And I would love to do that here. I would love to do that on our next show. It requires a little bit more, another logistical thing to think about beforehand. But I really am committed. Yes, I have a vision, right? And within that vision becomes an agenda, but it is not about me at the end of the day. Like, it doesn't matter if I envision that, this thing is going to be the best, next time I'll ask everyone to wear red or whatever it is. If audiences come and like, that doesn't work for them, then I'm not creating an experience that has as much value and impact. And therefore, what does that mean? It just means I want people to feel, come away feeling rewarded and filled and nourished by the event. And so whatever I can do in service of that, so that they walk out of the concert space and feel like there was maybe something shook around in their heart or in their body that needed to be shaken around, or they heard something that they'll continue to think about, or even they just found a sense of, had a moment of deep relaxation or release or uplift, whatever it is that person needed, right? But I want to, what I create is really in service of that, so much more than my vision. So that is, I'm glad we're speaking this right. It's a helpful reminder for me of how much I feel committed to listening to my audiences in addition to listening to kind of the business as its different entity. And I try really hard when I'm on stage, right, to tune into who's there and and speak. And we always have some sort of reception afterwards. I'm immediately in the space with people afterwards, trying to get a little bit of a sense of, how things landed. But explicitly soliciting, asking for feedback, and then using that to inform what is created in the future feels really important to me.
Your community decides who you become. I'm telling you, It's the best quote.
Yes.
It comes from healthcare, but like it's so relevant.
Yes.
Can you feel Sophie's passion for this project? I love her energy. Later in this episode, Sophie talks about some of her favorite underrepresented composers. After this interview, she sent me a list of some of her favorites, and I'll be sending these out in my newsletter next week, along with bios and information about each person. If you're interested, head over to zeitgeistacademy.com/radio to sign up. And while you're out there, feel free to jump on social media and give me a follow at Zeitgeist Academy on both Facebook and Instagram. I really appreciate it. Let's talk about genre for a moment. It sounds challenging to piece these together. So far, I love the idea, but how in practice do you piece together genres which can be kind of emotionally very different? Like I'm in one space when I'm listening to classical, but I'm in another space when I'm listening to folk. And that, how do you build an evening so that that transition is natural and not jarring?
Yes, great question. This also depends very much on the show and the performers on the stage, right?
Right.
So we do have, if I have, say, like a hip hop artist and a classical duo and a soulful singer-songwriter, right? We're going to be entering completely different energetic listening spheres for these moments. And versus if I have a show like the last show I did, which was with my collaborator Charlotte and James Bird, our dear friend, a singer-songwriter, and we just kind of decided to, we looked at each other and said, I think we want to really create something all together that we start a thread at the beginning and we really weave it, kind of continue this energy throughout. And so we were so conscious and careful and conscientious and loving with how we designed the transitions from one piece to the next, and we thought so much about what is the shape of this particular piece. James would say, oh, I have this piece that really is kind of opening and expansive. And Charlotte and I said, great. Afterwards, we'll put these pieces, this classical collaboration by Karen Tanaka that is kind of in a similar energy, right? It starts out really open and expansive, and then it kind of like takes you somewhere else. And then if it closes at a kind of quieter space. And then James said, oh, and I have a piece that kind of opens very quiet and is a little more complex and dark. And we said, great, out of that, I'll play the Chopin Ballade. And because it starts, again, it's complex and colorful, and then it emerges into the light, right? So sometimes we can design a show like that, where it's pretty organic and amazing. And then sometimes I have to completely surrender to the fact that it's going to be very different and just lean into that. And so again, try to be, I ask all of my performers to tell me what they will be performing beforehand. I would much prefer, some people like to, I'll just kind of feel it in the moment and see what wants to come out. But I want to know what you're playing, and I want to listen to it and understand what's going to make sense to land where, because we often still can shape an arc that doesn't throw people's nervous systems off, at least.
Right.
Because there's some classical music that's much wilder and more frenetic, right? And some that's very soothing and sultry and nurturing. And so even within the classical music we play, being very intentional about what the transitions are, and then within, it just takes on a whole different level of complexity and level of intrigue to me. I actually love it. I love thinking about the show as almost like, a theatrical production with different scenes that come side by side. My mom is a theater director, and I realized at some point in my career that part of what I do is a little bit like being a theater director.
Yeah.
I actually like that part of it a lot. and I think a lot about it, and I'm very it's I can really just pour over the set list, because I think that it can the performers have, there's so much that has to do with what makes a concert really special, but the way that I put the program together really can make a big difference too. And so I think a lot, I do think a lot about that. Um,
About how many performers do you have at a time in a concert?
well, this season we've had 3 performers on stage at each show. And in the past, it was more like, generally, I think it was 4, and I had as many as maybe 7 at
Wow.
once.
That would be a lot if there's 7 from all different genres.
Well, and then in that case, I had like a jazz trio was part of it, right? And so there was, so it was not all unique entities.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes,
Do you perform in every concert?
I do. I have thus far. Yes.
Nice. And what do you like to perform?
Oh my gosh. So I spoke at the top of the show about how much I love playing music by composers that don't get played very often.
Yeah.
And part of it is because it feels so special to me to give voice. Like there's something that I just think about this music. Much of it has not been recorded before. Much of it basically sits in archives. It lives wherever it does, stored in digital files or physical files, just as sheet music. Like it just lives there and it's stagnant and it's quiet. And how amazing to be able to give this, like transform something that's just notes on a page into something that is not only, it is alive sonically, but is shared with other people then. So I just love, especially because I just think about, I'm such a nerd sometimes, but I'll just sit there and think about like the amount of time and energy and devotion these people have put into writing this music. And like, how preposterous is it that it doesn't get played and doesn't get shared? So I love giving, like, I love giving space to that. And I am also astounded time and time again by just how great so much of this music is. It is just phenomenal music. And I love so many of these composers for so many different reasons, but I mentioned Karen Tanaka earlier. I love Karen Tanaka, a composer who's still alive and has written pretty prolifically for a blend of different instruments, but also has a nice fleet of pieces, a nice repertoire for solo piano. And they're very diverse. So there's a couple that are very short. One I love to play, it's called Lavender Field. And it just shimmers. I just can't, it just shimmers. Something about the way it works harmonically. It's pretty simple and it's repetitive. It plays like things over and over again, but I will use it often at the beginning of the show or at a moment when I really want to draw people in, and it is profound, right? The way that certain types of music can impact many different types of people. So that's part of what I find is powerful about that one. On the flip side of Karen Tanaka's repertoire is she wrote this series of what she called techno etudes, and they are rhythmic and wild, and they have this kind of a very repetitive bass line that runs throughout. It kind of drives and grooves, and I'm a total sucker for a rhythm. I've always wished both that I was a drummer and that I was a killer jazz player, because I could play I can just lose myself in rhythmic riffs all day long. And so the fact that there is both this kind of ethereal, harmonic, transportive harmonic terrains that Tanaka creates, and then also these rhythms that I just, when I get into, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I groove. I groove.
Yeah.
Um, so she's one of my favorites. But I can name very many, and I wish we had space and time for that, because I love naming them and speaking about these when I was in Israel, I learned a whole bunch about. I kind of dove into the Israeli music library archives. They have a storehouse of a lot of the local Israeli composers, and so I met a few and corresponded with a few and learned music by a few, and so I have a whole library of Israeli composers I love, and
Well, if you want to name some of them, I can put them. I have a newsletter that accompanies each episode, so I can
that's lovely.
put my newsletter out, and the archives are available if people are listening later. If you want to send me some names, I can
Yes.
put a list together if people want to go and check out some of these people. I do know that our audience is interested, so
Fabulous.
yeah, awesome. So let's say that I happen to find myself in Massachusetts or on your mailing list, and I want to attend a Connections concert. So, can you set the scene for me? Like, what's going on in the room? Again, you're so detail oriented, but heart oriented, and also your curation. Like, what are some things that I can expect walking into the room? Um, Either big items or small items that I may or may not be aware of, the things that are setting the scene for the
Yes.
evening. What can I
Great.
expect?
Well, I'm smiling as you ask this question, because it really depends on the show
Of
again.
course, yeah.
And in Massachusetts, already the last two shows we did were radically different. And even the environments we were in different venues. That's one of the things that I've done, is performed a lot at different types of venues. So that in and of itself creates a very different experience. So the first show we did was at Bombyx, a great just a beautiful venue and old restored. It was a church originally, and it so there people are seated on old pews. The stage is beautiful. There's very beautiful light, both naturally kind of showing through stained glass, and then they also light the stage very nicely. Um, there's always going to be a piano on the stage, and hopefully a fine instrument. I do love to play on instruments that can really do the pieces justice, and that you would be surprised by how much of a challenge it can be to find really good instruments. So I've been lucky to pair with Falsetti Pianos, a great piano store in the region here in Massachusetts, who supplied a piano for that first show at Bombyx. And yeah, and there'll be people there who are lots of different ages. We actually provided free childcare at the last show, because that's one of the things in this community, as I listened to this community and have become a mom myself, saw how hard it was for parents to get to concerts, to see live music, because childcare is hard and times are hard, and figuring it all out logistically is just can feel so burdensome that it's like a big intervention to try to make it happen. So one of the things that I've become committed to, and we'll do again in September, is doing matinee shows.
Okay.
Which allows for, so one of as you said, paint the scene. There will usually be natural light in the space too, because it's not an evening show. And that creates a little bit more, it is certainly a different flavor, but I have come to really love it. I've come to really love a 3 p.m. show, both as an attendee and as a performer. I think there's just a way that people are um yeah, people come with a little bit of different energy in the space, and um, we as performers respond to that.
Yeah.
So that said, so that's potentially one environment. We have another environment. Oh, and usually having a reception, so really usually having there'll be an intermission in the middle and moments where the audience is really invited to engage with each other. And so even at intermission, I often find that people will speak to strangers a little bit, and then we have a reception, a space afterwards where people can gather and speak again. So really orientation towards community, right? Um, the last show we did, it was an evening show, and we kept the lights really low when people came in, and we had these big, amazing oracle cards that we put kind of on the they were on a like basically projected in the background. Um, and they shifted throughout the show, but it was very much more like you were entering a darkly lit forest and kind of like wandering around amidst these and finding these kind of magical creatures along the way, versus in the middle of, at a matinee show, it might be a little bit more open energy than darker. So I didn't really answer your
No,
question.
you did, which is expect something different every time, which is
Yes.
its own kind of delightful.
Yes.
Oh, that's so cool. We could talk for so much longer, but I do think I need to wrap up with our final question. So you know what zeitgeist means, yes? Do you know what zeitgeist
Yes.
means? Yes, I
Yeah.
thought you would. Um, so I so I have this moment called zeitgeist moment. It's just that it's a phrase that I'm using to kind of express what we all feel. I just don't know another word for it, where we are listening to music or we're involved with music or making music, who knows, and you just kind of it clicks and you plug in
Yes.
and suddenly you're greater than yourself. You're part of something. You plug into that spirit of the times, whether it's the times broadly in the whole world or maybe it's the time of the evening or the moment. Um, but I think it's a moment that we all uh, seek for as musicians, both to provide to others and to experience ourselves.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you what was either a recent or a memorable zeitgeist moment. I'd actually like to share with you one of
Yes.
mine to give you a chance to think about yours. And as we were talking, like I had one in mind, but I have to share two. So I'll make them quick. So,
Great.
first off, we've talked about genre and curating and kind of throwing in these little surprises. So I had one moment recently. We went to see Cake, the
Great.
90s band.
I was a
Um,
super fan back in the
oh,
day.
yeah.
I
And of
could
course,
sing.
they were great. But
Yes.
their opener, you know who they had for their opener?
Tell
Was
me.
this Ukrainian like folk rock band that sang in Ukrainian. They sang folk style, the really tall, nasally folk style in Ukrainian. And then they were like going to town on the drums, the tradition. They wore traditional outfits, traditional
Oh
big
my
hats,
God.
and they sang like a folk mash. It was always the folk mashup with some other style. So they rapped in Ukrainian. They
Yes.
did 12-bar blues in Ukrainian,
Oh
and it
my
was always
God.
juxtaposed with this folk style. I'm like such a fan now. That was just the particular moment was when they hit that like this crunchy harmony in their first song, and it was
Yes.
so pure and perfect and really crunchy.
Yes.
And I was just like, okay, this is going to be really cool. So
Yes.
the moment I intended to share with you earlier, just thinking about curation, I was in Montana recently, and had the great privilege to attend a songwriter's performance put on by a friend of my brother. And he worked so hard, and talking about curation, especially of the artists. There was a moment where, because they had four singer songwriters on
Mm.
stage, and there was just a moment where it clicked for me how absolutely perfect the four were with each other.
Mm.
And I spoke with him later, and he put a lot of time into saying, okay, if this person says yes, then I want this person. If they say no, I need to go with these. Like he really put together
Cool.
so that the flow, they had just this tie of similarity, but
Yes.
also very distinct differences in personalities. But the tie between them all was seamless. And it was
Yes.
just a really beautiful evening to witness someone else curating something very particular like that. So
Love that.
those are
Love
two moments
both.
that were special to me where I kind of plugged in. So I would love to hear from you. What is a moment that's either memorable or recent?
Great. Well, my brain went in 20 different directions.
Yeah,
When
I'm
you were
sure.
sharing about the first, this Ukrainian group, and you said something about the crunchy chord, and I just couldn't help thinking of one of my all-time favorite artists, Jacob Collier, who just talk about crunchy chords. And I certainly have, when I listen to Jacob Collier, more than maybe any other artist, I will have just those moments where I'll just get kind of a full body shiver and just, whoa, like whatever just happened right then, just like percolated into every part of me in just this wild and unexpected and phenomenal way. Um, but as a performer, the other moment that came up for me was one that I just kind of whispered about earlier, which was on stage in April of this year and leading the audience in facilitated kind of engagement experience, which I hadn't ever done before in the way that I did. So it felt vulnerable to me. I do a lot of things that I'm not used to doing, right? But in general, there are things that oftentimes they're things that feel like a little bit familiar. But this year I've been doing a few things that feel very new. One of them is singing in public, which is, my own, using my own voice in public, which I'm very used to using instruments. Rather than using my own voice. So that's been edgy. But this one was also edgy because I was asking people to kind of take this meditative journey with me. But we got to this point in the meditation after we'd gone through a couple of iterations of kind of breathing and music and orienting our bodies in space. And when I invited the audience to sing, the sound that emerged from this group of people, I said, so maybe you want to bring your voice. And immediately someone just started, and then the whole room just like erupted into it was so beautiful. It took my breath away. And I think someone commented to me afterwards in the audience that they could tell how moved I was because I almost started to cry. It was so beautiful and it's completely spontaneous, right? Nothing, nothing orchestrated except for saying, you can use your voice now if you want. And it was aharmonic and arrhythmic and all of those things, but it was so perfect. And so
Wow.
it just, I just, I was my breath was taken away and my words were taken away. And that doesn't happen very often, certainly not when I'm on stage and thinking about 1,001 things at once. For me to be so arrested by the sound to be nowhere but right then, kind of overcome an emotion was very significant.
I love that. Oh, I got shivers. Oh, that sounds amazing. Well, Sophie, thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a total pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Zeitgeist Radio. I'm taking a break in August, so please use this time to catch up on any episodes you might have missed. Thanks for all your support, and make sure you are following me on social media so you never miss an episode. And of course, I send a great newsletter where I dive into something interesting brought up by each guest. If you like learning about music and culture, please come along on this journey with me. That's zeitgeistacademy.com/radio. Music for this episode was created by Ian Boswell. Please hit that subscribe button and tell all your friends you found a cool new podcast. See you next time.